Okay, we are on. So, ladies and gentlemen, dear guests, dear students, and dear Melissa, welcome to our business workshop. Our guest today is Professor Melissa Beran Samuelson from the Arizona State University. Thank you very much for joining us here. It is very early in the morning in Arizona, so thank you especially for that. I will leave actually the floor to you to introduce yourself because you will do it better than I can ever do. And our topic today is an important topic. It's about ethics in business. So the floor is yours. I'll not be spending any more of our time. And so please welcome here and start your session. Everybody in the audience, feel free to join the discussion anytime you like. Just switch your mic on and speak. Okay, so Melissa Samuelson.
Sure.
Well,
should I go ahead and show my screen right now? Does that work?
Yeah.
Great. Is it
works.
showing now? It should be
Okay.
now. Great. Good.
Yes.
So hello, everybody. As the professor said, I am a professor at Arizona State University within the W.P. Carey School of Business, and I'm really excited to take an opportunity to be here with you today. Just to give you a little bit of background on myself, I actually teach business ethics at Arizona State University, and a big focus of my teaching is actually working with students who are majoring in accounting. And one of the things that I think is very interesting is that when it comes to business, a lot of people who are managers, a lot of people who are trying to become CEOs of their own companies, those kinds of things, they have a tendency to think of themselves as professionals, but in fact, when we really take a look at what makes a professional, people like accountants, people like engineers are really the only careers within business that can allow themselves to really be held up as professionals. And I can talk a little bit today about why that is. But one of the things that it comes back to is the ethics. The ethics that these people have to uphold, have to exhibit within their work and their responsibilities to protect the public in how they operate. So you might already have a little bit of a familiarity with how that works with engineering, but certainly that also applies within accounting as well. And so just to give you a little bit of context, that's where I teach quite a bit of our courses at Arizona State University, is how to operate as an effective professional. My background, however, isn't in accounting. Interestingly enough, my background, actually, my PhD is in international politics. So, and I also have a work background as well, where I worked in international development and quite a few nonprofits. So kind of highlighted on this slide for you are different areas of the world where I've worked. Or studied. I got a master's degree in Australia, but I've also worked quite a bit in Africa and in Central and South Asia, in India, Nepal, Afghanistan, did quite a bit of work in Jordan and Algeria. And so I'm more than happy to answer any questions you have in regards to that work. I also am starting a new project actually this next year on business development in Uganda. So really excited to be looking forward to doing that. So for me, it's not just about business ethics, but international business ethics is really a fascinating area in which to think and to work. So in terms of research, as you're probably aware, your faculty, your professors always have to do a lot of research. My research really focuses on behavioral decision-making processes. So how do people make decisions when it comes to especially ethical conflicts or ethical dilemmas? How do people know if they're making the right decisions? Some of the factors that I study in this is narcissism, right? So I don't know, does anybody know what narcissism is? Could anybody kind of define that for us? I know that's kind of probably a little bit of a more
Considering yourself in high regard.
good, yeah. So it might be considering yourself in high regard, right? Higher regard than the people around you, for sure, right? Good. And so, you know, the role that that plays in decision making is actually really interesting. I have an article that I published recently, well, I guess somewhat recently, I guess it was about a year ago, but having to do with how narcissists make decisions. They actually make decisions using slightly different factors than people who score low on a narcissism scale. Another element I study is what's something called Construal theory and framing. So basically, I study the way that people think about the world and how that impacts their eventual behavior. So we all, you know, need to be aware, I think, that our perceptions or our values influence how we behave. And I know that might seem a little bit obvious, but it can impact our decision making in interesting ways. So again, I'm working on some papers having to do with how we frame our decisions, how we frame our choices. And then finally, I do research on professionalism in business. So particularly, how do professionals operate? How can they be effective? And that really tends to inform a lot of my teaching. So, you know, kind of as I have promised for today, you know, if you were able to see kind of a description of my objectives for our talk, it's pretty wide ranging. And I did that, I guess, somewhat intentionally because I want you to find what you're interested in our discussion, and feel free to jump in, ask questions. Please ask questions. There's a lot of interesting things happening in the world today. Like I say, for example, I have a PhD in political science, and in the United States, we just had an election that kind of shifted the course of the United States. We're no longer going to have Donald Trump as president. We're shifting presidents in the next couple years, and I'm more than happy to share, I guess, thoughts, any questions you have about that, because ultimately, you know, the decisions that we make, and this is something we're going to be getting to in a little bit, the decisions that we make as a society, right? And the goals that we set for ourselves, either within business or within organizations or as a culture, right? They say something about our values. They say something about our ethics and what is important to us. And in the United States, just like a lot of countries around the world, we've got a lot of diversity in those values. But there are certain themes that start to emerge as you start to understand what's important to a society, what's important to a culture. And so, as I was preparing to talk to you today, I thought that would probably be one of the most interesting things for us to discuss today, right? Is our values that we exhibit as a culture, the ethics that we hold dear, and in an international business environment, that can be kind of a tricky or difficult thing to start to get a hold on or to understand, simply because, like I say, you know, within a country, we've got a lot of different values. We've got a lot of different, you know, kind of subcultures that exist. But internationally, wow, the diversity just really explodes, right? So that's really, I think, going to make for an interesting discussion today. And I can speak a little bit about, you know, the culture, the environment, the ethics of business in the United States. And I have a little bit of data that speaks to the ethics and the values in Croatia, but I'm going to need your help in order to contextualize that. So that's where I hope, like I say, you'll have a lot of questions. We'll have some interaction as we go through our discussion today. So as we get started, does anybody have any questions about me, my background? One interesting thing. When I worked in Afghanistan, for example, I used to help women give birth. That was fun. I worked a lot with midwives. So I've worked in a lot of different contexts. In India, I worked quite a bit in the microfinance area. So if you know what kind of microfinance is, giving very small loans to people so they can build their own businesses, that's another area. So again, one of the things that is kind of tricky about me, I guess, is that I have a really diverse set of experiences that I bring to bear. And even within, again, looking within the United States, I don't know if you can see my little pointer here, but I'm from right here in the center of the United States. I'm from a place called Nebraska, which most people outside of the United States have never heard of. In the US, it's actually referred to as flyover country, meaning that people only fly over it when they're on their way from one side of the United States to the other, that it's not really worth visiting on its own. It's very agricultural. And I think in part that's what really influences my curiosity about the world, because I kind of grew up in a place where we didn't have a whole lot of diversity. But as I started to go abroad and study more about, just how people think about the world, that really is what has interested me in behavioral ethics and decision making. Okay, so just kind of moving forward here, I think it is helpful to get a sense of what I mean when I say we're going to be talking about ethics and values. I do differentiate when I talk about ethics, the difference between ethics and another word that often seems to be the same, but I think is a little bit different, and that is morals. To me, ethics show how people actually behave. They're the operational side of morality, right? So morality really refers back to the values that we hold. Ethics is how we act based upon our morals or based upon morality, right? So to me, ethics is really about action and the behaviors that exist and that build upon, I guess, our values, right? The things that are important to us. So there's two types of ethics. One type of ethics is normative ethics. Normative ethics refers to the expectations of how we should act. Those expectations tend to be defined by society, and they tend to take the form of things like laws, rules, codes of ethics, right? And certainly for people who work in a profession, they tend to know that normative ethics really define how they need to operate as a professional, right? So when, for example, in the accounting profession, one of the values is transparency, making sure that financial information is transparent and easily communicated, right? That is a normative ethic or a normative value that needs to be exhibited through the behavior. The other side of ethics, though, focuses a little bit more on the behavioral ethics, and that has to do more with the how of ethics. So what do we actually do when we're faced with pressure from society or from a boss or within an organization, right? And so to me, when I do a lot of research, I'm actually less interested in normative ethics and what people say the rules are. And I'm actually more interested in behavioral ethics and how people act or behave in a given context or in a given situation. So as we go forward and as we have this discussion today, again, I'm going to be talking about more ethics and values. Ethics being the actions that people take, right? The expectations that people have of those actions, but values as being more the internal side of that, right? What's important to us? What are we trying to uphold when we act, as we make our decisions within a professional context? You know, one of the questions that really stands out in the world today is, you know, can we actually teach ethics? And that's why that definition that I just talked about is so important. If we talk about ethics as behaviors, then I think that we can teach ethics, right? One thing I don't do, and I very explicitly, I tell my students at the start of every semester, and what I'll tell you now, I don't think we can teach people their morals. I don't think we can teach people what to value. People adopt their values, they adopt their morals based on the environment that they grow up in, based on, to some degree, an internal drive to do what they see as right in any given situation. But if we talk about ethics as living out those values or living out those morals, then yes, I think that this is something that we can talk about teaching, and it's a skill that can be developed as we go on throughout our lives, right? So really, as we move into professional lives and professional careers, the core of our identity as a professional is going to be what's important to us and the types of behaviors that we exhibit to show that in our actions, in our work, in the decisions that we make, and how we implement our choices. So as we move through, again, this discussion, it's important to think about what's important to me, what do I value, and how can I exhibit that in the choices that I make as a professional, right? And so again, I see this as important, and I teach this within the context of accounting, but I also fully recognize engineering. That's another profession. There's a set of responsibilities there, a set of expectation that you don't just serve the company that you work for, right? You are in that profession for the development of society, right, as a whole. And if you make bad choices, if you greenlight products or innovations that are actually harmful to society, you should be held accountable for that. So again, understanding what is good for that profession and living that out is an important part of ethics, and we can learn how to do that and learn how to be more effective in that. So I guess I want to get a couple of different people giving me their thoughts because this has been a big question throughout history. Where do ethics or where do values come from? Do you think that people are born good? Are humans inherently born good people and society slowly corrupts us? Or another theory goes, humans are inherently selfish, and actually society and rules make us better. It whips us into shape, right? It makes us more ethical. Or there's a third option, are humans born with no ethical nature, right? This idea, it's called the blank slate theory, right? Humans are born without any ethics. And everything that we exhibit in terms of ethics has to come from the environment or society. So I'm just curious, what do you all think about where our ethics comes from?
I personally, continue.
Sorry, you're first.
Okay, yeah, I personally think that we are born with some biological preferences, and we biologically become aggressive, and that can impact our values, but our values are generally learned and inherited from our family and our environment. That's what
Okay,
I think.
good, good. So some
I have
biological component.
I have a similar thought, but I worked with children a lot, and I noticed something about children. They often how do I say it, show selfishness, they are mostly inherently good, okay? But during their life, based on their environment, they change, will change.
Good.
Okay, can I jump?
I think it's only. I'm sorry.
Okay, sorry, Jakov, you are speaking, so please continue.
Okay, thanks. I think it's the third option actually, because even what my colleague said about children being inherently good and showing some compassion or something, I think that that also depends on what kind of environment they grow up in. It's not the same if you grow up in, I don't know, in some kindergarten in Croatia or in New York City or in Afghanistan. That's not the same story.
Excuse me, can I reply to that? Okay, I partly agree with that also, but there are always two sides. Like, I don't know, there are children born in very problematic families who have, I don't know, drinking father, no mother, etc. And they behave compassionately towards others. And there are also those who were born in, how do I say it, good families and turn otherwise.
Yeah, but that all depends about the environment. As I said, I mean, it's still the environment, I think, because of course, what you said about this good family, bad family, father drinker or something with no mother, but it's still that is the environment. Still, that's still the environment, family environment or outside environment, school, teachers, and others. So it all boils down to the environment and society, I think.
Yeah, but not completely. It goes also with biologically, I believe, because there's a story. There were two sons and they had a drinking father. One one grew up and was alcoholic, and they asked him why. He said, "I watched my father." The other one never drank alcohol at all, and they asked him why. He said, "I watched my father." So there's some biological component in that, I'm sure. We are born with biological potential, and then it's about it's on us and our environment to shape it in something.
Yeah.
Okay, can I join the conversation, because there are two written questions on the chat board, and I will read them. But
Sure.
Before I do, I had an idea. If you if you want to study the human biological nature, a good point to start is to study monkeys. And there are, realistically speaking, we were more or less chimpanzees, like, I don't know, 100,000 years ago. And the evolution is not really that quick. But those monkeys are studied very extensively by this English lady. I cannot remember her name, but she's very famous.
Jane Goodall. Yeah. Jane
okay,
Goodall.
You're right. So, and I recently watched a documentary with her, and it was eye-opening in a way. So how similar are the monkeys to us, and to the extent that they lead their own wars, and it's totally crazy. But nevertheless, it was just a thought. I will read the two questions. The first one came from Ivan, who said, how much different ethic rules are between different areas? For example, between accounting and engineering, are there any rules that are the same in all areas? And the second question is from Antonio, who said, I believe that people are inherently selfish, but that selfishness is actually what keeps us together as a society. It is in our interest that we are as a whole more prosperous, so that we as an individual could have access to more resources. So these are the two discussions from our students.
Good. So to kind of touch briefly, because I'm again, depending on how the discussion goes today, I'm not sure how far we'll make it. I think you said the first one was from Ivan, correct? So when it comes to Ivan's question, there is actually quite a bit of overlap in professional ethics when it comes to accounting and engineering, which I found to be pretty interesting. And I think a lot of that comes back to, first of all, the role of professions, which is ultimately to protect and create good for the public. And that is true for accountants. That is true for engineers. That is not true for individuals like salespeople within a company, or supply chain management, or managers within a company or an organization. Their ultimate responsibility goes back to the company and no further. But when you register as a professional, you have a broader obligation. And so due to that, there are certain values that you are expected to uphold. And so part of that is, the one I touched on briefly, transparency. Depending on the type of engineering that you go into, it's kind of like accounting. Depending on the type of accounting certification that you get, whether you're a tax professional or you're in management accounting or public accounting, there can be slightly different definitions, but all of it goes back to a need to serve the public or society at large. And so I'm hoping that we'll be able to touch on that a little bit more, but if we don't, I'm going to make sure that you have my email address so that you can connect with me and we can continue that conversation if that's a strain of thought or conversation that we don't get to delve into, but that you are interested in, because I do think that that's interesting, and that's something that I've begun working actually with our engineering school at Arizona State at developing an understanding of in their ethics training as well. Ethics training, that's another important part of being a professional, is understanding our obligations. And so that's again, something that I'm very interested in. And like I say, if we don't get to have a chance to go into detail on, please connect with me more so that we can talk about it. Yeah, I think the idea, coming back to kind of where our ethics come from, there are certain philosophers who do believe that humans are inherently good, right? That we become corrupted by society. However, there's a lot of, for example, let's see, Hobbes, for example, the philosopher, really believed that humans were inherently selfish, that in fact we're all, animals, just like, the chimpanzees and the animals that we've evolved from, and that, at our core, that what society does is civilize us. It makes us, less prone to those animalistic tendencies, but in part, that's part of what makes up human nature. I think one of the more dangerous, and the philosopher and writer Steven Pinker points out, he actually wrote a book called Blank Slate that points out that the idea that people are born with absolutely no ethical programming is kind of a dangerous assumption. I don't know, I'm just curious, before I start to share here, I'm just curious though, does anybody here have children? Children, more than one child? No, nobody wants to admit to being a parent. Okay.
I have.
Okay, good. You have children, Murat. Murat, are your children the exact same since they were born from the same genetic pool and raised? I'm assuming you raised them roughly the same way.
Actually, I'm sorry to disappoint you, but I have only one.
Oh, okay. Only one. Only one. Fair enough. Are they just like you, though? Did you raise them just the way you wanted?
Well, we are a multinational family, and in that respect, I think she is more raised as a Finn, and so I would say I have had my influence, but still she has parts from both sides.
Okay, good. So a good combination. Anybody else?
Okay, I don't have my children, but I have two nephews who are siblings actually, and they're
Okay.
also from an international relation. So their father was Indian, and their mother was my sister, obviously. And but they're siblings, so they're genetically the same. But they're totally different in character, so they're absolutely different. So
Yeah,
yeah.
I'll share. I don't know if you can see this. These are my two sons.
Okay.
Okay. I know it doesn't look like it because they have different color hair, but they are genetically from the same pool. And one thing I can tell you, these two boys, very different personalities. And I could tell that from the very beginning as their mother. And one of the things that, I think is interesting about human nature and our ethics and our values is that there are certain components that we are born with, kind of an ethics rough draft, so to speak, right? When you're writing a paper, you have that first iteration, that's your rough draft that you get down on the paper. And what society and what the environment does is it causes us to modify that rough draft throughout our lifetime. So it's not 100% one and it's not 100% the other. We're not 100% good. We're not 100% bad. There is an element of ethics that we are all born with, but what the environment and what society does is it gives us opportunities to develop, to change that rough draft, to make edits, and to evolve. And that doesn't stop when we turn 16, and that doesn't stop when we turn 18, and that doesn't stop when we're 20 or 30 or 40. We are constantly engaging with our environment, engaging with our society, right? Gathering these experiences and making edits to our behavior, to our values, to our ethics. One of the there's a video, I don't know as though I can share the video, but it's like 15 minutes long, so it's something that might take some time here. So I don't necessarily want to get into that today, but if you Google, oh gosh, what's the name? Hold on just a second here. I have to find it. There's a video that actually illustrates this. The name of the book is Just Babies, Just Babies. And there's a short video online that's called Born Good, kind of like I have on the slide here. What that video does is it kind of illustrates for you through a video of experiments done using very small children, like 2-3 months old, and kind of shows how that rudimentary rough draft of ethics is formed within humans and how that starts to evolve as we get older. There's a certain period of our life, as was pointed out earlier with the student who has worked with young children. There's a period of our lives where we are very inherently selfish, even if we hold certain values. But as we grow and as we develop, society and the environment continues to evolve our understanding and our practices and our behavior. So again, I encourage you to take a look at that book. It's actually written by a researcher called Paul Bloom, Bloom, and again, he's done a lot of research with babies and children to kind of understand the origin of ethics and where our values come from and how they continue to evolve over time. One exercise that I like to do, and I wish we were in person so that we could do this together, but I want to talk to you about it. there is, oh, hold on, I think I've messed up my screen share here. Oh boy. There we go. I've actually done this with groups of students in a lot of different countries, and even with multicultural groups of students. So even in the United States at Arizona State University, we've got a large number of students that are from other parts of the world who come to study. And I usually give this task as a part of our class time together. And I break everyone up into groups of 2, and I ask them to draw me a house. And they have to do it without talking. And through the entire exercise, they both need to be, you know, holding that writing instrument, that pen or that pencil the entire time. So they have to be next to each other and they have to kind of share the task. And I only give them a minute or 2. This is really fun, by the way, is to get a bunch of 20-something-year-old people drawing houses in the middle of class. And one of the things that I have noticed is that when we do this exercise, all the houses they draw look like the house in the middle here, right? I actually, like I say, I've done this in the United States. I've done this with my students in France. I teach at the University of Paris twice a year to their master's degree in business ethics. I've done this in Mexico. And time again, what I get is I get students that are drawing this house in the middle, even though these students come from a variety of cultures, a variety of backgrounds. Why is it, do you think, I'm interested, why is it, do you think that we end up with all of these students drawing this same house, this house in the middle? Maybe if I asked you to do this, we would end up with this same house. Why is that? Anybody have a theory?
I have. Although
Okay.
we're different, we all have similar characteristics and views in some aspects.
Good.
To general values, thinking, I don't know.
Yeah.
Or it's just a symbol for a house, because you know it's just a sort of powerful symbol that is symbolizing a class of objects that are pretty similar everywhere you go, and that there is a reason because the houses are similar. But I was thinking about ethics, the ethics that people develop through their lives. It's just a way of a massive societal organization helping us to be as successful as the species and
Good.
more successful than the others. So it's just a way of organization of society that keeps us better than the other competing species, I believe. So we are pretty efficient, in more efficient in that way than if we, you know, kept behaving like animals, like, you know.
Right. It serves an adaptive kind of value, right? That it allows us to exist within societies. It allows us to interact and be more productive as a result. Good. Good. Yeah, one of the most interesting, actually, one of the most interesting explanations I've ever gotten about, you know, why humans tend to draw the same house was actually with a group of engineering students in Mexico, which is why I value the perspective of engineering students so much. The students said, you know, it kind of relates back to what you've all been saying. You know, a house needs to have a roof to protect you from the rain. So this represents the roof, right? A house has to have walls to protect you from, you know, the environment around you. You know, so all houses have walls. You have to have a way to get in and get out. So it has a door, right? I think engineers just have a great sense of the function of a house, the construction of a house, and why those elements are important. And to me, this directly ties back to how we think about values. We have a variety of different experiences. We have a variety of cultures that exist throughout the world, but there are certain universal or shared aspects that combine in our understanding that allow us to exist within societies, or that allow us to exist as humans who are able to interact with other humans for our own betterment, right? For our own development. And so as we take a look at that, within ethics, there's actually a term for this. The term is hypernorms. Hypernorms are shared values that exist across all cultures. Now, there's been a lot of research done on what these shared values are. I've picked out 6. These 6 shared values are those that I think might be most prevalent within business, for example. But all cultures share a value of honesty. All cultures value compassion, or predictability, or integrity, or something like responsibility, or being fair, right? One example that you may have heard of, and I've actually got a chart that I typically share with my students, but something called the golden rule is another example of a shared value that exists across cultures. The idea that we should treat other people the way we would want to be treated, or to treat other people the way they would want to be treated. The cultures vary in how they kind of make this value statement, but it exists in any culture that you examine, right, as a unified society. So whether that tradition be religious, like Christian or Muslim or Jewish, right? Some of the monotheistic religions, this value is also exhibited in the Buddhist tradition, in Confucianism, even in humanist traditions and societies. This is always stated as a primary goal or value in human society and human interaction. So my next question for you is
So
that
just,
given...
Melissa, just a second. We have a
Sure.
question from Ivan.
Yes.
Who says, why predictability? A short
Why
question.
predictability? Yeah, this predictability is an interesting one. What predictability refers to is, as a hypernorm, what we value in society is that people behave in the way that we would expect them to respond based on cultural norms. Okay, so that's what we're valuing when we say we value predictability. It's a little bit different. It's similar to the word integrity, right? But the word integrity, or the value of integrity, means that we act in the way that we say we're going to act, right? So when you behave in a way, if you tell your friend, for example, yeah, I'll be there on Saturday to help you move, right? To help you move apartments or whatever, then integrity means that we show up and we behave in the way that we say we're going to behave. But think about predictability as being kind of the cultural component of that. What predictability means is that if I tend to know that my friend is always going to be 15 minutes late every time we get together for dinner, or every time we make an appointment, right? Predictability means that we value, or we take into account, some of the cultural or behavioral shifts that might exist there, right? So for example, there are normative shifts that can occur when it comes to integrity, but predictability means if we expect our friend to be 15 minutes late, we won't necessarily be offended because it's customary, right, for them, or within a society, for example, that nobody is exactly on time, so it's okay to be a little bit late or a little bit early. Within the United States or within certain parts of Europe, if you say you're going to be somewhere at 2:15, you have to be there at 2:15, right? And that value of predictability means you show up at an exact time. Whereas with other cultures, what predictability means is there might be leeway. Do you see what I'm saying? I don't know if that kind of clarifies. Does that help?
Yes, it's much more understandable when you put it that way.
Yeah. Yeah, the question I usually get from American students is, isn't integrity and predictability the same thing? Because in the United States, typically what you say is what you get, right? And so they are very similar, but again, what predictability shows is that there might be other cultures where you say one thing, but there's an unspoken meaning, right? That has to do more with predictability as a value.
Yeah, now when I see this integrity sign on my screen, it comes to my mind something from popular culture. There are these movies, footages of Warren Buffett.
Very different people, both rich, but very different.
Yeah, but I guess Warren Buffett is richer than Donald Trump, but never mind. He said that the most important factor when looking who to actually hire to his company is integrity. So can you comment a little bit on that? I think it is very important for our students to hear this message, because integrity is how much the organization can trust you as a worker, as a manager later on, and so on. So Warren Buffett says, okay, if a person is dishonest, so it is. So he said, what is important? Important things are integrity, ability to work hard, and the cleverness. And so he said, if you are basically a crook, then it is better that you are stupid and lazy than otherwise, because so it's pretty obvious, but you have to put it in that way so that people understand why is this so important in business organizations.
Yeah, Warren Buffett is a really interesting example. And he's one that I really like because, as I mentioned before, I'm from the state of Nebraska, and so is Warren Buffett. He is known as the Oracle of Omaha, which is a major city in Nebraska. So I relate to him as a fellow Nebraskan, and I I follow some of his understandings of what it means to have integrity in business, because it very much represents, I think, some of the understanding of American business culture, right? A lot of American business people look up to Warren Buffett, but in particular, kind of my own regional values align with those of Warren Buffett. I think a really good example, so Warren Buffett is a major investor, and he runs a group of companies called Berkshire Hathaway. And so within Berkshire Hathaway, there's a lot of different companies, organizations that are a part of that portfolio. I have a friend who actually works for a Berkshire Hathaway company called Executive Jet Management. And what this company does is, they basically rent out or, serve as private air transportation for corporate executives, right? And so what they do is, a company or an organization who needs a private jet for their CEO or for a management team to get from one place to another would hire this company to help maintain their airplane, provide pilots, provide service so that they can take private jets to make sure that they get to meetings on time or whatever. my friend Fred Calvert, he actually is the Chief Compliance Officer for Executive Jet Management. He's the Chief Ethics Officer, really, for that company. And what is interesting is that within the Berkshire Hathaway companies that Warren Buffett owns, even if they're not publicly traded, even if they are mostly a private company like Executive Jet Management, they are required, every company is required to have a chief ethics officer. That's not true of every company within the United States, like I say, but it is something that is required because Warren Buffett sees that ethics and integrity needs to be central to all of the companies that are held under the Berkshire Hathaway name. So he requires that. Now, the way that Fred actually got that job is because within a previous job or position that he had, he actually resisted pressure from a client to put a plane in the air that he didn't feel was safe, to put a long story short. And I've had him come to classes and actually talk about this, but what's really interesting is that he was willing to stand up and say no to a client, to risk losing a client's business, because he felt that safety and integrity came first and that what the client wanted should only come second to that. And so in doing that, he lost his job. In fact, the client sued him, right? And he had to fight this in court. But he ended up with this great job as a chief ethics officer within one of Warren Buffett's companies because he was willing to stand up and say no. I actually, you know, can share one other example that's a little bit closer to home. 2 months ago, my brother actually got a job with a company. He'd been looking for a job for about a year, right? In the United States, you know, we kind of have been going through some rough times in terms, you know, with COVID, right? It's hard to find a new job. And so there's been a lot of hiring going on. And my brother found a new job a few months ago. He was working for a company called ServPro, which does a lot of cleanup of, for example, if there's a disaster like a hurricane hits. My brother got sent down to Louisiana to help clean up after a hurricane. He was supposed to be kind of on a management track within the company, but he was working at different levels. And as he was working down in Louisiana, one of the things that he noticed was there were a lot of unsafe or questionable practices that were occurring within the company. And when he got back to his home location, which is up in Minnesota, he actually complained to some of the executives. He said, I'm going to resign. And he actually sent in his 2-week notice, right? Because, you know, within the United States, it's customary to give 2 weeks notice before you quit a job. And with that 2-week notice, he sent in a letter detailing all of the ethics violations, all of the rules and safety violations that he had noticed, and said he wasn't comfortable working for that company anymore. When he sent that in, he actually got a phone call, right, the next day from the CEO of the company saying that they were apologizing for the experience that he'd had. They were creating a new ethics and compliance position, and they wanted him to apply. And so my brother has actually gotten a promotion last month because he was willing to point out the problems within the company, because he was able to illustrate how integrity within the company was being violated and offer solutions rather than just walk away from the situation. So we see within companies and within organizations that integrity tends to be valued, and that, like I say, these are just examples within the United States, but this is a hypernorm. This is something that exists across cultures.
Okay, perhaps I could append to that if I can. Okay.
Sure.
So about the role of the integrity in business organization, I tend not to view it just as a sort of feature that you should have as an employee because it's good. But it has everything to do with companies' business interests, because in that example from Berkshire Hathaway, imagine if something happens, if a plane crashes or something like that. It's a huge reputational risk. That company would go out of business immediately. And so a lot of companies, especially those doing with a lot of public or with such a sensitive job like the airplane operation or something like that, they are facing very much of reputational risks that could come out as a result of non-integrity of their employees, which that don't have to be high managers in that organization. Right. So it's, and in the Warren Buffett example, I think he knows very well that perhaps our students are not aware that he's an owner of Coca-Cola, of probably Wrigley's or something like that. So he owns a lot of mass production companies, and it is extremely important for him to reduce the reputation risks, and they have very much to do with the personal integrity of employees, especially managers. And then the next thing I wanted to comment is I read somewhere, I cannot find it anymore on the internet, but I read somewhere that in the United States, like about a half of the senior managers in corporations are engineers by their first vocation.
Yes.
So this is something that is important for our students because they're studying technology. Yes. So it is something to hear about, because as I want to always want to say to them, there's more than just technology or technicalities or techniques or what you're studying now. So the life is sort of long, and the career can be long, and you will probably want to develop. So that was me. I'm leaving the word to you.
Yeah, so that actually builds into really the idea of professionalism, right? Because there are two ways in which integrity is understood for companies. And this is why when I say accounting and engineering are the two disciplines that have that ultimate professional responsibility to the public, this is how that shows up. This is why they are really ultimately responsible for the integrity or the reputation of the company. From the accounting side, it has to do with the finances of the company, the transparency of finances, making sure that, you know, when we get investors, right, or when we have shareholders buying shares of our company, that they're doing so on the basis of true and valid and transparent financial information. The other side of that, though, integrity of companies and organizations, especially for those that are creating, you know, products or consumable goods, has to do with engineering and the importance of engineers. And engineers, again, as a profession, have a responsibility to the public in terms of creating safe products. And when engineers fail to do their job, right, when they fail to uphold integrity, honesty, transparency within their work, we see that, you know, companies can fall apart, companies can fail, companies can, at the very least, see sharp downturns in stock price or share price. You know, one example of where engineers have been influential in this was the failure of Volkswagen with their diesel engine technology, right? You had engineers who were helping to falsify energy efficiency in the diesel engine technology. And when that happened, Volkswagen saw a substantial downturn. Another major example that occurs to me, I recently watched a series on on Netflix about the Challenger disaster at NASA in the United States, right? The Challenger was a space shuttle, blew up in the 80s. The people who attempted to blow the whistle to let the managers know that the technology wasn't safe, it didn't support the rocket launch, those were engineers attempting to protect people. But because management suppressed the voice of the engineers, right, we had this huge disaster within the United States where we had all the astronauts die upon liftoff, of this space shuttle. And so, within the United States, I think there is just this great awareness. It doesn't always happen, right? But that, there are certain professions like accounting, like engineering, that can be the whistleblowers that can protect companies and the integrity of companies. And in my teaching, a lot of what I do is I talk to students about how to do that effectively, right, within the context of the organization. I can kind of flip through here just to illustrate that. Let me see if I can just kind of skip. I mean, when we talk about companies and organizations, now let me just, I've got a lot of slides here, but, what is the importance of ethics, right? Well, ethics allows us to do a lot of different things. We can, reduce complaints. We can reduce litigation, right? We can, reduce costs when it comes to compliance programs or legal fees. I mean, I'm not going to read all of these to you because there's a lot of reasons to be ethical within companies and organizations, right? I mean, here's even more, avoiding loss of stock market value. But one of the things that we do see within research in the United States, the chart I want to share with you is this one here. Companies that rate highly when it comes to ethical behavior, companies that address consumer issues or ethics issues, tend to outperform companies that don't prioritize ethics. And so there's actually a company called Ethisphere. It's owned by the New York Stock Exchange. And one of the things that this Ethisphere does is they actually go in and they do ethics audits on companies, right? They actually are able to audit companies based on, their compliance programs, how they treat their employees, how they deal with customer complaints, management practices. It's actually a holistic ethics audit, and companies that do very well on that actually tend to be more profitable or outperform the general large cap index in terms of stock price or share price within the United States at a rate of about 15% across 5 years, right? It varies between 14 to 15%. This is the 5-year premium for the most recent period, but prior to this, it was actually closer to 15. So it is really interesting to take a look at how profitability is impacted.
Okay, we have, it seems we have 3 questions. First,
Sure.
Slađan raised his hand, so let him speak first, and then I will read 2 other questions.
Okay.
What if personal society ethics and company ethics collide? You said disaster happens, people lose jobs, lives, and company may force you to do something unethical. Is judicial system trustworthy, and is being ethical connected with law protection?
It is within the context of the United States, and that's the only context in which I can really speak. We do have whistleblower protections within the United States. One of the things that's really interesting that I teach for accounting students who are often responsible for blowing the whistle on financial crimes, regarding financial statements, quarterly statements, and irregularities, is that even if you're wrong, right? Even if you're not correct and you notify the Securities and Exchange Commission, which is responsible for overseeing financial crimes within the United States, you are protected, right, from retaliation. I don't know what the situation is, you know, for example, across Europe, if there is general protections or within Croatia specifically, but within the United States, there's been a very big effort through laws like Sarbanes-Oxley or another law called Dodd-Frank to help protect people who might blow the whistle on crimes that they see occurring within their company if their company refuses to address those issues when those issues are raised. So that is a major problem, and one of the ways in which they've attempted to solve that problem is actually in creating not just legal protections, but if there is a prosecution or if the company is to actually, you know, indicted and levied a fine for financial crimes like what happened in Enron or what happened in WorldCom, some of our major financial disasters, those whistleblowers actually receive a cash payout. They get, you know, 10 to 15% of that fine as a reward for blowing the whistle. So there's been a concerted effort to kind of incentivize whistleblowing and protect those whistleblowers within the United States.
Okay, then another question. Slađan, are you okay with the answer? So he's not saying
Thank
anything,
you.
so okay. So
Okay.
I turned off the mic when I'm
Yeah.
not using.
yeah. Okay, Antonio says, I have a question about ethics in accounting. Are we going to see another Enron-like scandal in the near future with the growing friendship between accounting firms and the companies that they are auditing? A lot of the big accounting firms in the United States offer a lot of non-auditing services, such as consulting to the same companies that they are auditing.
Well, not if I can help it. I'm trying to reduce the tendency, at least within our students, our accounting students at Arizona State. That's a great question. I love that question because there's a great article that I actually make my students read every semester. We just finished our semester today, actually. So I wish I had some of my students here to tell you about what they had learned in my class. Maybe they could say whether or not we're going to stop the next Enron from happening. But there's a great article called Why Good Accountants Do Bad Audits. And I make all of my students read that because a lot of the scandals that we see with accounting, interestingly, can be traced back more to people exhibiting bias in their thinking and in their decision making than actual intentional fraud. Now that was less true in something like WorldCom or Enron. There was intentional fraud taking place there. One of the things that we study in my class is another major scandal called Health South, where financial executives and the CFOs were actually forced by the CEO to commit fraud until one finally went and blew the whistle on what was occurring. But you know, I think that as a way of kind of getting at your question, which is a great one, that in order to really stop those major frauds from occurring, we not only need to address intentional behaviors, but we need to address biased behaviors. And that has to do with what you're talking about, that close relationship between major accounting firms and large companies. And also some of the you know, biased behaviors that occur with the conflict of interest. Under the AICPA, the organization that oversees public accounting, within the United States, large accounting firms are not supposed to be offering consulting services to the companies that they audit. It still happens, right? And there's been a lot of censure over that. There's been a lot of companies that have gotten in trouble for doing that, but it's still happening, and it's a major problem. And it's because, again, I think because bias creeps into that decision making. And as long as we as humans exhibit bias in our behaviors and decision making, which I think we always will, we're going to need to be able to be educated about how our decision making is biased, and we need regulation in order to do that to some degree. So it's a great question.
Okay, I can maybe give a brief comment. I'm working in a relatively big company, which is a part of even a bigger company. And since recently, under our accounting law in Croatia, we are not allowed to use the services for accounting auditing from the companies that provide consultancy for us or for connected companies. So it is being gradually regulated. As you know, Croatia is a part of the European Union, so we have all the legal acts compliant with the European Union, and they are pretty much on the sort of edge of what happens in the legislation covering the accounting audits. We have another question from Ivan, and then another hand raised by another Antonio. So let me read Ivan's question first. How often happens that people lose their job because they were not willing to act contrary their ethics? And he's got another question for me. Are there people responsible for ethics in Croatian companies? So Melissa, the first part is for you.
It's hard because there's not a lot of statistics on that. I think that that's a hard number to evaluate how frequently it is that people lose their jobs. So for example, I think I mentioned earlier, Health South was it was a major accounting scandal in the United States. What was interesting about that scandal was that the CFOs who were being pressured to oversee the financial fraud within that company, Health South actually went through 5 CFOs in a 7-year period. So the turnover, right, was really high. And it wasn't that those CFOs were being fired, but what is more common within the United States, or one of the things that we see, is that people step down, people quit, people become exhausted, people become demoralized. And so, when a company is behaving unethically, that pressure can actually create stress. It creates illness even within a lot of the employees. So when companies behave unethically, that's not just a problem for investors or shareholders. It's a major problem when it comes to the culture of a company and employee morale, which is, it's just a whole other topic that really we can get into. But that certainly impacts, people staying within companies and whether or not they quit or move away. Unethical behavior within companies decreases an organization's ability to hold on to quality employees.
Okay, then to answer my part of the question, are there people responsible for ethics in Croatian companies? Yes, as from recently, I believe from the last year, for example. The government of Croatia adopted a regulation requiring all publicly owned companies and state-owned companies to have compliance officers installed. And in effect, the fact is that I am a chief compliance officer in my company. But I don't cover general compliance. I just cover compliance with energy laws, which has something to do with our market behavior, because we are a network operator and we have to treat every market participant in the same way, although one of the market participants is our owner. So but then it develops in Croatia as well. And the trouble with compliance functions in countries with culture like ours is that there are a few things that I can object to. First, those possibilities to turn somebody in because of unethical behavior is sometimes misused by some people who want to, who got some personal agenda against somebody who is, for example, a manager in a company, and then, they turn those persons in for more or less falsified stuff. Although it quite often happens that there are true occurrences that are turned in, but then it's complicated. It's not that easy, and then there is this culture that nobody wants to be a snitch, so it's very hard to break such things in people's minds, especially after decades of growing that kind of culture. It's not easy, and but to answer your question, there are people responsible for ethics. First of all, every board member is by definition responsible for ethics. The other question is that some board members actually misuse their position, but then and from quite recently, Croatian companies, publicly owned, that is those who are listed on stock exchange, and state-owned companies are required to have to implement the compliance functions, and they're working on it probably. Antonio Cerniščak raised his hand, so please, the floor is yours. Ask your question.
Yes, thank you. This is maybe off the topic, but I'm really interested considering the inequality between people in America. Do you see more riots and even civil war happening in a few years?
I hope not a civil war.
But there is a possibility.
I mean, there's always a possibility. But I think that it's less. It might be becoming less likely. What's interesting about the United States, actually, this is a great opportunity for me to show you a little chart here that helps to explain this. Let me go back. Within the United States, when we take a look at dimensions of culture, there's something called Hofstede's dimensions of culture, which some of you might be familiar with. And what Hofstede's dimensions have done is basically he evaluates culture across 6 different kind of values. And one of the trends here, so the purple is the United States. Just for point of comparison, I've given you Croatia in blue here. And one of the things that we've seen within the United States, and I think gets to Antonio's question, has to do with the values of power distance and to some degree individualism. So we see that in the United States, we have really low levels of power distance and really high levels of individualism. So I was hoping to kind of get into this and kind of talk a little bit about these different dimensions of culture, but within the United States, one of the things that we see is that there is increasing inequality, and that relates back to this idea of power distance. United States is a little bit low, as you see, with a number of 40 when it comes to power distance. What that means is that within the United States, culturally, we don't like to see divisions within society, that we prefer to see everyone as being equal. We prefer to allow everybody to kind of have evenness in decision making or participation in decision making. And so when people are left out in a democracy of, the conversation when it comes to decision making, that increases the tendency for things like protests. But within the United States, we also, as I mentioned, we have a very high level, much higher than Croatia, right? We're actually one of the highest in the world when it comes to individualism, which means we hold other individuals accountable for their behavior. So what these two measures mean, the lower level of power distance on a scale from 0 to 100, we have relatively low power distance but very high individualism, is that we see the discrepancies as being a result of individual choices, not as a result of the system. Right? Not as a result of government or society. And so I think in a way that actually makes something like a revolution less likely, because what people are doing is they're really fighting as individuals, or they're disagreeing as individuals versus disagreeing, or feeling that the political system or the economic system has created the problem. Does that kind of answer your question?
Yes, I understand what you mean.
A little bit? Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, we have another question from another Antonio Peter. But first, before I read it, what is masculinity? And why is the United
I
States
hate this
better
term.
than us in that regard?
Yeah, masculinity is horrible. It's a horrible term. Really, instead of masculinity, and again, in English, this translates to male versus female, and I think that's an incorrect use of the word by Hofstede. But really what that means is competitiveness. Masculinity relates to competitive behaviors. Let me kind of show you here. Masculinity is the degree to which a culture emphasizes competition and individual achievement as being essential to success. So when you're higher on masculinity, or within the literature, it's also called competitiveness, this is a culture that values being the best as an indicator of success, whereas lower scores, right? Croatia's about average, just under average with 40. There's a higher emphasis on liking what you do or quality of life as an optimal goal when you value or when you decrease that value towards competitiveness. So that's one of the differences within the.
Yeah, okay, that explained everything, because first when sorry.
Can I comment on that?
Sure.
I was watching and I read a lot of Jordan B. Peterson work, okay, and he often emphasized masculinity as behavioral differences in males and females, and why is masculinity good? And it's often used in negative connotation, like abuse behavior and such. And I think that's fairly incorrect, because people showing masculine characteristics are often, as you said, they are competitive, work driving, family oriented, society oriented, and mostly they drive community to do good.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the major criticisms of Hofstede's dimensions, is that he uses the word masculinity rather than the word competitiveness. I mean, so for example, if we think about, gender, which masculine versus feminine automatically gets us thinking about, right? It doesn't seem to be a good definition of, what they're trying to say about cultures. You know, thinking back to, oh gosh, you know, major female, you know, prime ministers and leaders throughout the world, Angela Merkel, thinking back to, the Iron, what was her name?
Margaret
I'm
Thatcher.
blanking.
Margaret Thatcher.
Margaret Thatcher, thank you. I mean, she was hyper masculine in a lot of ways, right? She was not a very feminine figure, even though, you know, she was the first female prime minister in the United Kingdom. But what high masculinity is really saying, again, is it has to do with competitiveness, this idea that being the best, winner take all, you know, in communication, what high masculinity cultures like to do is they like to talk about their achievements, what they've done, right? That's a primary topic of conversation. Within high masculinity cultures, there's also a really big focus on targets and goal setting within organizations, right? So divisions are often evaluated. For example, you know, an engineering division would be considered successful or not successful based on whether or not they hit their targets or their goals for the quarter. And often within the United States, the way that masculinity or competitiveness plays out is we hold individuals accountable for that behavior. So again, it's a problematic term because masculinity automatically kind of brings gender into play, but it's really not a gendered term. It's really more about competition and the degree to which a society or a company or a culture uses competition to drive the definition of success or to drive goal setting in their behaviors.
Yeah, when I read this masculinity, you know what was the first that came across my mind? It was Italian stallion, you know.
Yeah.
So it looked a little funny. There are two more questions.
It's a problematic term.
Yeah. Two more questions from the first one came from Antonio Peter. Would a split Congress be better for the US economy than a Democrat-controlled Congress? As far as I understand, the markets prefer a gridlocked Congress that provides more predictable conditions.
Yeah. That is true. When it comes to kind of the economic behaviors, markets hate uncertainty. And that's also why in the United States right now, given that we're going to be transitioning between a Republican Trump presidency into a Democratic Biden presidency, there's an anticipation that there's going to be a lot of instability that results from that. So we're expecting actually some volatility in the markets, which is probably going to be, you know, exacerbated, right, made worse by the fact that we're having to deal with, you know, the COVID pandemic on top of all of that and the uncertainty that that presents. And so to some degree, a gridlocked Congress, at least initially, could be good for markets. It can be problematic in the sense that, you know, it makes it more difficult for legislation to pass through, even legislation that might be perceived by businesses and companies as being positive. But so within the United States, we have, you know, our election to president every 4 years, but we also have what are called midterm elections every 2 years. And so I would see within the midterms, if there was a shift towards, for example, a Democratic Congress that aligns with the Democratic presidency, that would still maintain that stability within the markets, allowing a slower adjustment to a democratically controlled government versus a Republican controlled government. But it'll be interesting to see how that evolves because we still have some senatorial races still up in the air. So we're not sure right now within the United States to what degree it will be Republican controlled or a split Congress.
Yeah, okay. About the legislation, I think that probably businesses can see the legislation as a source of instability if you change it too often, which we have as a sort of a problem. Croatia had a relatively brief period with a very weak government, which was politically very weak, and during that time, it seemed that the economy was doing pretty well because there was nobody to to make obstacles. And the country of Belgium had like a year or two without government at all, and it was very good for their economy. So sometimes, I mean, legislation is not a bad thing, but if you change it all the time, you make conditions unstable. And therefore, making harder to change legislation can be good in certain conditions. There are another question from Marco. Should Julian Assange and Edward Snowden be pardoned?
That's a great question. And that would all, So with Julian Assange, that's a harder thing to say. Edward Snowden, as an American, right? That might be a little bit easier. To be honest, I don't have a strong opinion either way. But one of the things I think that's interesting about that is the way in which Americans either hold those individuals up as heroes or vilify them as, kind of, bad guys or villains in that case. In the United States, I think that question is really problematic because when you put secure information out there that has the ability to actually harm, agents in the field or people who are attempting to serve, American interests loyally, that's really problematic. At the same time, Americans also value transparency. So it's, that's a tricky thing. In fact, not that this has anything to do with your question, but to illustrate how I feel about this, I will say, so I trained for triathlons, right? Ironman triathlons, which are these big long distance events where, I can't remember what the conversion is to kilometers, but you swim 2.5 miles, you bike 112 miles, you run 26.2 miles, all in one sport, all in one event. And my least favorite event has always been the bike. And I actually named my bike Edward after Edward Snowden, because in some ways I love to bike, but in some ways I also hate it. So I think that that's really representative of American perceptions when it comes to those types of things, is that we want that transparency, we want clarity into how our government operates, but at the same time, Americans have trouble reconciling that with the loyalty that we expect. And so, I wish I had a better, more well thought out answer for you, but it's a really complicated issue when it comes to, privacy and security versus transparency in the public interest. And I think that the majority of Americans would lean toward wanting to see them pardoned at some point.
Okay, I'm looking at this screen and I'm considering this individualism. What's the source of so big a difference between the states and Croatia? Croatia is probably similar to other European countries. Can it be in traditions like like Protestants and Catholics, and can it be something like which is deeply rooted in society, more deeply than people usually are aware of?
Yeah, absolutely. Again, I thought that these numbers were so interesting because one of the things that it does, and again, I think we could take a whole hour just to unpack this, but One of the things that this chart does is really illustrate some of the great differences between Croatian society and the United States society. If you search Hofstede's Dimensions of Culture, you can really compare Croatia to any country in the world to kind of get a sense on where they fall on these variables. But the United States in particular is known for our high level of individualism. And what that represents is an orientation, again, toward individualism and the idea of autonomy versus collectivism. So when you have a really high number like we have in the United States, what that indicates to you or should show to you is that we have a very loose-knit social framework where we hold individuals accountable. People are expected to take care of themselves. If they're taking care of other people, that's limited to their immediate family. Whereas lower numbers like what you see in Croatia are more collectivistic, so emphasizing a commitment to the group, however that group is defined. Family, extended family, or loyalty, for example, to a company or to an organization. So what this means, for American businesses, for example, is that Americans will look out for themselves first and their company second. What this contributes to in the United States is a really high turnover. So Americans tend to be very highly mobile. Americans like myself, for example, we don't tend to stay in the places where we grew up. We don't necessarily stay close to extended family. We move around quite a bit because our primary responsibility is to further, for example, our own careers or our own interests or our immediate family's interests, rather than create kind of a stable family, extended family network. And like I say, for companies or for organizations, what this tends to mean is that people don't stay with the same company or organization for their entire careers. Americans will change careers on average 5 to 6 times throughout their lifetime, which is a really high turnover rate when you think about it. And employees also tend to be very self-reliant. They seek out their own answers, their own solutions to problems within companies rather than asking for support or help from management. Americans also, though, on the plus side, when it comes to individualism, it means they're a lot more comfortable working with people they don't know because they're used to doing that. They're used to relating more one-on-one, working with people that they're not familiar with versus working within established social networks and cohesion. So individualism within the United States, has a lot of historical basis, but it also influences some of the other factors in the chart, like power distance or masculinity, for example, that competitiveness. When we look at that level of competitiveness and we match that up with individualism, we see that, within companies, it's not just companies competing with each other. There's actually individuals within companies who are competing within companies as a values priority within company cultures and organizations.
Okay, thank you. There's a raised hand by Slađan, so please speak.
Sure.
Okay. As far as I know, in USA, you are not poor if you. Okay, let me rephrase it. It's hard to be poor if you finish high school. Okay, you just have to finish high school and you'll be able to live normal life. Okay, how does a society like that highly regards individualism ends up as people advocating socialism, as we can see recently, especially during elections, blaming government for their life failures and such?
That's a great question. It has to come back, I think, not to blaming government for failures, but what Americans are often doing is they're blaming government for lack of opportunities. And so it has more to do with, so with individualism, we hold ourselves accountable for our successes and failures, right? But what they're doing is they're holding the economic system, or they're holding the government accountable for providing the opportunity to achieve or succeed. I have not heard this before, the idea that, you know, if you graduate high school, you know, that you know, you can achieve a good life. Within the United States, I think my understanding is more a college degree is what allows you to do that. High school, you know, when you turn 18 and you graduate high school, is less of a predictor of success than higher education, which is the 4-year degree that you would get after that. And I think that's where the economic opportunity opens up more. One of the frustrations with that, though, comes back to the idea that within the United States, and I don't know the situation in Croatia, so you would have to tell me, but within the United States, there is a it's very difficult, it's very expensive to go to college or to university, and that expense is almost entirely on the individual. And so that's one of the frustrations, and kind of, as you say it, like that move to socialism is the desire to have more government support, so that, for example, when you graduate high school and you want to go to university, that financial barriers are not what prohibit you, right? There's a lot of students who have very high intellectual abilities but cannot make it to university because they can't afford to pay it. And so the frustration with government is that within the United States, the government doesn't help support getting a degree. You have to be able to pay for that on your own, and it's often very expensive. Even at a school like Arizona State, we have a lot of students who start at what are called lower tier community college schools before they transfer credits into university because they can't afford to pay university level fees. And that can impact their career processes going forward. So I think that's where kind of that high level of individualism starts to kind of overlap with what you called kind of that tendency towards more socialistic values and criticisms of government.
Okay, can I ask you another question? Sure. Okay, what you actually pay in USA is not knowledge; it's actually diploma. Yes, because here in Croatia, going to university is free. Okay, country provides you, but if you're not in university, the material knowledge is hardly, how do I say, approachable to common people. Whilst in USA, I can watch MIT lectures over internet. I don't even have to attend college to watch their lectures.
Yeah, but you can watch them from here as well.
Right.
I actually do watch them.
In Croatia, the systems of college are closed. We don't have online public. You understand?
Yeah, but for example, you can't watch my lectures publicly. That's only a select few. You know, and while I take, I think there is validity in the idea that the knowledge is free. The problem is that you're not going to be assessed on that knowledge. So there's no way to validate that you've gained the knowledge without a degree, meaning that you've scored appropriately on exit examinations, that you've developed the skills, that you can actually implement that knowledge. And that's where the degree comes into play versus just being able to, you know, watch a lecture. I mean, you know, I could watch, for example, you know, I watched an entire documentary on, you know, the Challenger disaster, but that doesn't make me an aeronautics engineer, right? Just because I understand that material and I watched some videos and learned something about it. And so, you know, within the United States, that's the value of the degree, is it's it's a way of certifying your abilities to implement the knowledge that you've developed through those courses.
Yeah.
And so, you know, that's the level of professionalism, is having that certification.
I agree is that, well, it obviously has to exist, but the in USA, you'll probably get opportunity to approach that than in Croatia. In Croatia, we're not highly industrialized. We're not the biggest economic force in the world. We don't have so many companies. Here it's mostly about relationships with people. You can be most educated person in Croatia and still fail. Well, it's least likely in USA.
And that's actually, so if you take a look at this chart, if you look at how low, and this is just me, okay? I've not been to Croatia. Someday, God willing, I will visit Croatia and I'll be able to learn this a little bit better, right? But where Croatia is very low on individualism, that means they value their society, they value their networks very high. But another thing that's interesting is how high Croatia is when it comes to uncertainty avoidance, which means that Croatia is an 80 there. Compared to the United States, we're more middling, we're at like 46. But what that means is that Croatia is going to prioritize those networks, right? Because they don't want to risk hiring somebody they don't know. They don't want to risk, you know, putting a lot of investment into innovation. They'd prefer to invest in established technologies, right? I mean, that's my interpretation of what could potentially contribute to that in these results. Whereas the United States, we're higher towards individualism, and we're more likely to hire people just based off of a resume, because we have more of a, like that 46, that middling uncertainty avoidance, where we're more tolerant of not knowing somebody or not knowing, you know, how they're going to be implemented. You know, even worse than, or even higher than Croatia, you know, I used to work in Afghanistan. Everyone who was hired there, you had to know somebody. Like it went without saying, right? And in the United States, that's considered, when it comes back to ethics, right, highly unethical to only hire people you know. But within Afghanistan, that's actually an important part of social cohesion and creating stability within that society, because they also have a very high level of uncertainty avoidance. Right? They don't want to risk having somebody come in who's an unknown quantity or unknown variable. And so I would imagine it might be similar within Croatia. I don't know.
Okay. I have two more questions, and so I'll read them. And Antonio Celinchak, he raised his hand, but he gave up probably. Or if
Sorry,
not,
Antonio.
If not, he can raise it again. So the first question, Marco, is the individualism in the United States lowering with the new generations as identity politics are more prevalent? I don't know, I either don't see it, I have problems with my vision, slight problems, but again, is the individualism in the States lowering with the new generations as identity politics are more prevalent?
Actually,
Yeah, I didn't understand quite well, but perhaps Marco could turn the mic on and
sure,
join the conversation. Or if he's too shy, then if you, Melissa, understood the question,
yeah,
please give the answer. Yeah.
Okay, great. Marco, I think you've got a great question, so please feel free to jump in. I'm a nice person, so I'm more than happy to. I won't attack you if you've got a follow up. But I actually think that individualism is on the rise with identity politics in the United States. We see an increase. One of the things that we see in the literature, I mentioned earlier, I study narcissism. That's actually on the increase within the United States. And narcissism, again, the valuing of self is highly correlated with a level of individualism, identifying with yourself rather than identifying with a group or with a culture or with society. And so I think identity politics actually plays into that, into making people think that that their group, their society should correlate to them as individuals, and what they value as individuals versus feeling a need or a push to understand the other. That's a big part of what drives identity politics. And I think that that is actually going to increase individualism, not reduce it.
Okay. Now, before I read the next question, I noticed that we have some other guests from the United States here just joining us. Lucrezia from Washington State and her colleagues. Let me see, Mr. Mark Beatty, I see on the list. And we have another guest from Mexico, Elizabeth Schwartz. Yeah, so the room is getting with more and more people, and so hello to everybody. I guess we can continue answering the questions, and later on we can join. Everybody can join the conversation. So hello to everyone who joined. And we'll see each other in a minute. The next question is from Ivan. What do you think about weak regulations considering data collection and processing in big firms like Google or Facebook? Should there be more laws and regulations limiting these corporations? Do you think these new laws would help to ensure people's privacy, data protection, or even secure democratic processes?
Yeah, you guys have the best questions. I am so glad to have an opportunity to talk to you guys. That is one thing that we don't have enough of a conversation about in the United States, quite frankly, is the idea of data protection and privacy. That is a much bigger issue in Europe. Europe really leads the world right now in privacy and data protection issues. And I think that that's unfortunate given the potential for violation that exists in major American companies like you've noted, Facebook and Google and such. Americans, especially younger Americans who have grown up with this technology, no longer care how their private data is being used by those companies. And I think that that's something to be concerned about. That said, I'm not sure that American government has the will, has the strength to really create strong regulation there. Again, because it's not a conversation that we're really having in the United States, it's kind of receded into the background. And so I don't think there's a lot of political will to deal with those issues. I think that ultimately it's going to be up to the companies and the organizations themselves to regulate. And I think that Europe is actually going to lead the world in that regulation. So it's going to be, the responsibility of companies like Google and Facebook, as it has been more recently. They have to keep up with European regulation and then apply that to the American context, rather than American government regulation driving that, because it's just not happening in the United States.
Okay. Now Antonio Zelenchak raised his hand and he's waiting here for a while,
Sure.
so please.
Yes, I want to make up a follow-up on a conversation about the diplomas in universities. Do you think that it's worthy to go into university in America because you have to pay so much? In Croatia, if we had to pay anything, I know I wouldn't go because I don't think it's worth it. Because you can learn a lot from the internet, and more and more CEOs and bosses don't ask for diploma, but for the skills you have, and you can always go on courses. So is it worth it to go on university in America when you have to pay so much?
Within the United States context, it is definitely worth it, because within the United States, it doesn't, again, it doesn't matter how many certifications you have. Without the university diploma, a lot of companies don't feel comfortable hiring people who don't have the diploma itself that exhibits the degree. And one of the other major things within the United States in higher education that plays a role is that not only does it have to be a university diploma, it actually has to be accredited. We have some universities that are not accredited, meaning they haven't been certified by the Higher Learning Commission, or they don't have a designation from a major accreditation body within the United States, or within the business schools, for example. That's the AACSB, is our certifying body. And that certifies that not only is the degree valid, but that the way that we award that degree is regulated. You have to have a certain number of contact hours, for example, and those contact hours have to be of a certain quality, and all of those things. So education within the United States is highly regulated, and I think that among employers, that's really recognized. Now, that's not to say you have to have a college degree to have a good career. I know a lot of people who do not have college degrees, but engage in high-paying, typically what we call blue-collar work. So that might mean, working for the railroad. That might mean, working as, in air conditioning repair or construction. Those can be actually really solid careers and jobs for individuals that don't have degrees. But for intellectual knowledge, like, for example, working in computer engineering or software engineering, without a degree, it would be really hard to, if not get established within that career, to move up within that career, and rise to the level of manager without some kind of degree. And that's also why within the United States, we see a lot of people who go back for MBAs, Masters of Business Administration, or higher level degrees, to allow them to continue to advance in their careers beyond just a college diploma. And so that's, that tying back to the earlier discussion, that's the challenge within the United States, and the frustration is that it's so expensive to get that degree, but in order to have access to career advancement, you almost have to have that to move forward.
Okay. We have two more questions in the queue at the present. The first one is a little longer, so I'm gonna read it. Recently, there was, from Krešimir Kovačević, recently there was the largest general strike in history in India by the way, considering that the United States has some of the most powerful companies in the world and US labor unions are underdeveloped, what incentives do companies like Amazon and McDonald's have to not give their employees the bare minimum? Similarly, the healthcare industry in the States has comparatively lax pricing regulations, and most of their products have a pretty inelastic demand. When does seeking a profit in this industry become greed, and how could US citizens stop it without making the companies unprofitable and the field undesirable? I know that many US citizens have a unique position on healthcare, and I'm not trying to belittle them for that opinion, but those beliefs are rather self-destructive, and I see very little hope for change. The average US citizen spends almost twice as much money on healthcare, yet the coverage is very less. I'd rather have less people die from avoidable causes. So that was Krashimir's question.
Wow, there's a lot in that question. So I apologize if I don't address all aspects of it. The healthcare question is a really interesting one, simply because you depend. I mean, politics aside, it is a fact. The United States has one of the highest costs of healthcare in the in the world, and that is a major issue, especially as inequality. It exacerbates inequalities in health and in opportunities for healthcare. One of the things, or one of the issues that I think is important, is that we have seen within the United States a lot of protest and backlash against companies that raise prices on medications or on healthcare treatments when those treatments are seen to be unsubstantiated or unsupported. I know I've read a lot that the reason that we have such a high cost of healthcare within the United States is because companies need to be able to innovate and develop new drugs, and in order to do that, they have to raise the price of drugs that are on the market. That's been a big argument made by, for example, Martin Shkreli, who actually got into huge trouble within the United States with some of his drug pricing practices in his healthcare firms. Yeah, I think within the United States, there is a, again, kind of going back to this idea of, dimensions of culture and how culture could influence this. The long-term orientation plays a role. The United States tends to be pretty short-sighted, and that also correlates with indulgence. So Americans tend to be willing to pay for medication and treatment at higher levels if it provides a short-term benefit or what's perceived to be a short-term benefit. Oh, gosh, your question was so big. I'm just not sure I'm answering it. Can you kind of weigh in, and if you want to unmute, let me know if I'm getting close or understanding your question correctly.
So, Krashimir, can you jump in and engage in a little conversation? Wait a minute, please. Okay.
Needs to get to a quiet spot, probably.
Yeah, could be. Meanwhile, we are more than 2 hours now.
Yes, I'm sorry. This is a good conversation.
No, it's a good conversation, but I have this uncomfortable position to have to actually bring it to the end, because I have to give floor to our guests from the States who because I have to do rehearsal with them for the next week's workshop. And so after we resolve our question with Krashimir, then we have another one, and I suggest that this is the last one.
Wrap it up.
So to wrap it up a little bit so that people are not waiting much longer. So Krashimir, okay, perhaps until Krashimir. Oh, he's here. Is he here? Okay.
So what exactly did you want to know in relation to my question?
Am I answering it? Am I on the right track?
Well, I guess at
Because you
least
had a
for
big question, I know. So
Yeah, it's hard to remember everything.
I guess I want to say that technically the healthcare industry could still be profitable, even if it was cheaper, even if it was still private, but still it is rather expensive compared to the global standard.
yeah, I mean, again, healthcare in general, I'd have to take a look because there was actually a really interesting podcast recently that outlined why the American healthcare system is as expensive as it is. And like I say, I listened to it recently, but I listened to so many, it's hard for me to track exactly where that was. But a lot of it has to do with the way that we regulate healthcare as well in the United States, which initially was seen as, delivering value in making sure that there's substantial kind of checks and balances on how healthcare is used, but has actually resulted in eventual increase in cost, but a potential decrease in quality. And so what I think would be interesting for you is if I could find that podcast and send it to you, because that might give you additional insight. It doesn't justify the increased expenses, it merely explains why it's so high within the United States with healthcare companies, especially private insurance, and the role that that has played in the increased cost in the United States. And it's why there are people within the United States who also push for a more socialized medicine approach, central or government regulated healthcare. There is a push for that. Again, there's pros and cons to that method, but certainly kind of outlining the history of how healthcare has evolved within the United States has a lot to do with the role of private industry and how that's increased those costs over time.
Can I give a quick comment on it? We can recently see Trump administration doing a really good job on that, but I have some relatives in USA and Canada. Okay, in Canada, the same as Croatia, they pay their medical care through taxes. Okay,
Yes.
but as far as I know, their medical in any world is situation in any world. Any USA is leading in medical field. People all over the world come to USA to get a treatment. They have the best experts, best technology, and it always has a price. It's understandable. It's actually, I don't say it's not, how do I say it, shameful or something,
Right.
but it's understandable. Okay, we all want better, and that better is in USA.
Well, I don't necessarily disagree with you, but my problem is that most people aren't in the 1% who have a very specific health problem, but instead have very simple problems that maybe need a simple surgery or a simple cure, which
Right. And
most other countries can give you for relatively cheap compared to the US.
And within the United States, I mean, if you think about healthcare, a lot of our minority populations actually have some of the highest levels of death from preventable causes in the developed world. So the inequality when it comes to healthcare is quite great. And I think that that's among the greater concerns. For example, United States has one of the highest levels of maternal mortality in the developed world, meaning women who die in childbirth, just giving birth, right? Which is a very common condition in the United States. But if you go into some of these more urban and especially minority communities, you have a very high level of people who don't get sufficient health care to even be able to give birth in a safe environment. And that's a major concern given the high cost of healthcare in the United States.
Okay, thank you. And one last question in the queue from Antonio Peter, is affirmative action in hiring and college admissions ethical? Should they be based entirely on merit?
We've had a major scandal. I don't know if you've heard about this recently, where people of economic means were getting their children into very prestigious schools in the United States by paying bribes. That's been a major issue recently in the United States, especially at schools like Yale and Stanford. And so that's a major concern. When it comes to affirmative action and its effectiveness, certainly what it does is it increases representation within the United States, but there's been a huge backlash against that it should only be about skill. The problem with that is that, again, when it comes back to inequalities within the United States, what affirmative action or what doing away with affirmative action, what the courts have determined, the problem that creates actually has to do more with the fact that not every American has equal access to equal quality of education. So I guess a great example that I could give you from experience comes from having grown up, as I mentioned before, in flyover country in Nebraska. I grew up in a very rural area. When I was applying to Ivy League schools, a major challenge that I had, in spite of my test scores, was the fact that I didn't have advanced placement courses. I didn't have college level courses, which some students can take on my transcripts, on my high school transcripts. And that's because they weren't offered. They weren't available where I was from. So it didn't matter what my test scores were, I wasn't eligible to take the types of classes that students in the cities, for example, were able to take. Now, I wouldn't have been impacted by affirmative action, but that's just an example of how there are certain structural inequalities within the education system that affirmative action can help address, that pure, what are otherwise seen as objective measures can't always account for. So I think that there is a place for affirmative action, but it has to be thoughtfully implemented when it comes to making sure that it addresses inequality without creating an increase in inequality.
Okay, just one clarification for the audience. What is an affirmative action? So we're not very familiar with that term. Yeah.
Sorry, yes, the question asked, so I assumed, but affirmative action is the idea that when we are admitting people, and this has to do not just with colleges, but admitting people to college, there are affirmative action policies. There's also affirmative action policies that exist within companies and hiring practices where there is a certain preference. If you have two candidates that are equal on paper, the hiring preference or the admissions preference goes to the person who comes from a minority background, whether that be an ethnic minority. Typically it's an ethnic minority, but it might also apply to gender minorities in hiring. So for example, software engineering, there might be a preference that goes to a female candidate over a male candidate if it's felt that male candidates are overrepresented in that profession or in that company. What it doesn't do, and it's often misunderstood, is it's not intended to say a lower qualified candidate gets the preference in hiring or admission because of their ethnicity. That's often the interpretation. But what it's meant to do is saying, okay, if everyone's the same on paper, if two people have the exact same types of test scores or the same types of transcripts, you would hire or admit the individual who comes from a less represented background in order to kind of equalize or diversify that, that population that you're admitting into college or that you're hiring into an organization.
I would argue that it's highly unethical because while we're putting some groups up, we're putting other people down. It's okay. You said that individualism, as we can see in a graph, it's very important. Why should my ethnicity or religion or I don't care sexuality, anything, be even considered taken in action? I think that's basically utterly. I don't want to be rude, but you know.
Yeah, no, I mean there is a major concern with that within the United States. But the counter argument to that is if you come from a background that has traditionally been disregarded or put down or held back because you're female or because you come from a minority group and you've had fewer opportunities, one of the things that we do know with research in the United States is that representation matters. So when we only promote, for example, white males, white straight males, for example, then what that does is it decreases participation in the workforce from people who are not represented. And what that means for markets is that those interests or those economic opportunities get shut down. And so it actually can decrease market performance of companies when there is less representation. And so that is why things like affirmative action exist, is to make sure that we get better, more holistic, more representative representation regardless of opportunity. It's the difference between equality and equity essentially in markets and opportunities.
Okay, but the question is who's judging that? Because okay, I'm privileged white male whose parents took a loan that they have to that they'll have to pay until they're dead to pay my college, and some other guy I don't know who is from black community, or it doesn't matter basically, some other person with same merits that I can bring to the company, but he gets the job. So who's the judge in that?
Exactly. And that is, again, that's the tricky part of that, is how is that then assessed? Does it have to do with economic inequality? Does it have to do with racial inequality? And that's a big part, I think, of what the United States is grappling with today culturally in terms of how we define those levels of individualism. You know, there are a lot of different, I could even get into the electoral implications of this. It's a very complicated question, and it's one that people have a lot of feelings on, but the research is very clear that how we represent individuals matters. The emphasis in the United States right now has to do with more ethnic representation or cultural representation. There's less of an emphasis on the diversity of economic representation. But the United States, it's worth noting, does have a strong, at least within electoral politics, a strong history of trying to diversify economic interests as well. And that's what's creating, I think, a lot of the tension within the United States amongst ethnic minorities versus economic minorities.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. So I know we're over on time. There's a lot that could be said on these, but I want to be respectful of the other commitments. So yeah, it's great questions. And I don't know, Dubravko, if you can share my email with everyone. I am more than happy to answer additional questions over email or set up additional Zoom conversations if you just want to talk to me one-on-one or have me answer your questions one-on-one via Zoom. Like I say, our semester just ended today. I am finishing my final exam grading today. So I am free for the next couple of months to have any additional conversations that are helpful to you in kind of understanding the importance of values, ethics, culture, in companies and how organizations make decisions. So I'm happy to do that. Like I say, thanks to COVID, I've got lots of free time to sit down here in my office and have those conversations.
I can give you a quick tip. Currently, I have COVID and my wife. Okay, it's nothing bad. Okay, I had a little temperature and cough. Just get it and get over with. So.
Well, I'm actually in a trial. I have a vaccine, half of a vaccine in me, I hope. So I'm hoping I won't get it thanks to my trial vaccine, but we'll see. We'll see. I have a family member who got it, who got quite ill, in fact, and she's younger than me and just as healthy as me. So it impacts everybody differently. So I hope you all are doing okay and not getting the severe consequences of it.
Okay. So, Melissa, thank you very much for your presentation and for your offer to meet us again. And that there's been, in a principle, there's no problem to set up another meeting just any time. And the students have heard you just now. And if there is an interest in the sort of repeating the session, you just let me know and I will set it up. No problem with that. The fact that we are over time is telling us that it was very interesting to our students, and young people always like this kind of topics. And so we are grateful that you came here to visit us.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.